Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
All right, welcome everybody to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and I don't really know which episode this is going to be because I may place it over the holidays. I'm not really sure, so I'm not going to put a number on it as we speak. But this is one of the craziest incidents we've ever discussed on the show, and it's something I remember not in vivid detail. I do remember it happening, but it's been fun to research, and it's just one of the just nuttiest stories I think I've ever read about. We're going to go back today to December the 29th, 1978, to Jacksonville, Florida, to the Gator Bowl, and this will be a game between Ohio State and Clemson. So, as I've mentioned many times, without a playoff, you made the best bowl matchups that you could based on conference alignments, and you hoped that the best two teams played in a bowl, but they usually didn't. And so you let the bowl games play out, and then the coaches took a vote and the press took a vote, and you ended up with hopefully a unified national champion. And it didn't always happen, but that's how it was at least processed back then. So this was the night on December 29th, 1978 at the Gator Bowl that Ohio State coach Woody Hayes punched a player from the other team. Let's talk about it. That year, Ohio State was a disappointing 7-3-1, and Clemson was 10-1, I believe, coming into the game. They were Clemson was up and coming, basically, and Ohio State, of course, always a powerhouse, it seems. And nobody really knew that night that before the final whistle would blow, one of the most legendary coaches in college football history would deliver something so shocking, it would end his career almost on the spot. And I just cannot help but think about how this would translate in today's environment. But this is the story of Woody Hayes, the fiery, old-school coach whose temper finally caught up with him, and the punch that ended his reign at Ohio State University. And to understand that night, you have to understand who Woody Hayes was, okay, and what he meant to Ohio State, to the Big Ten, and to college football itself. Woody wasn't just a football coach. He was an institution. And, of course, anybody from Ohio State is going to get mad that I make this comparison, but I think it's fair to compare Woody's stay at Ohio State to Joe Paterno's as far as longevity and as far as clearly knowing who ran the football program, similar to Nick Saban at Alabama. People who are coaches who were there for multiple decades, not necessarily Saban in that instance, but I'm back to Paterno and Woody Hayes. Multiple decades, clearly the guy who runs the show. Hired in 1951, he led the Buckeyes for 28 years, I think it was. He won 5 national championships and 13 Big Ten titles. He coached Archie Griffin, the only 2-time Heisman winner. He coached guys like Rex Kern and Jack Tatum. His teams were always disciplined, powerful, mean, tough, all the old school football things you can say about him, they were. He built his football empire on what he called 3 yards and a cloud of dust, which is a saying we've all heard. A smash mouth approach that was basically rooted in toughness, and for him, rooted in control of the program. See, Woody Hayes was a military man at heart, and literally he was a World War II veteran, and he demanded loyalty, and he demanded discipline, and he demanded toughness above all other things. He wanted those things out of people. But this guy had a temper, okay? Woody Hayes had a temper. Not just the average sideline tantrum type temper either. He was famous for exploding at referees, throwing stuff like his hat, tearing up yard markers, even going after his own players. I mean, the guy was a menace in some ways, and like I said, as you're hearing this, think about how this will translate today. Some of you may be thinking, oh, it translates exactly to today. I know so-and-so who acts like this all the time at the high school level or the Pee Wee level or whatever level you're thinking of. In the 1970s, college football was changing, okay? The wishbone offense, the passing attacks were getting a little more sophisticated and flashy. Player individuality was kind of rising, meaning, I don't know, whatever you will call it, the look at me type culture was starting to sort of surface. Hayes was a guy from another era, okay? He was starting to lose his grip a little bit, I believe, on what was happening on the scoreboard, but what was happening on his own teams and what was happening maybe even in culture all around him. And that's a fair statement for probably anybody of his age back then. So by this time, he was in his pushing his late 60s, okay? And Ohio State fans were divided. Some still worshiped the ground that Woody Hayes walked on, and others were already whispering that the game, the players, how to deal with the youth on the team and stuff, that the game had maybe passed him by. So some people thought it was time to go. You know, any coach that's been in a job that long is not going to please everybody. I mean, you can talk about Paterno or anybody you want to, just about. Eventually, some fans are going to think it's time for change. And so Woody, though, was still Woody by 1978. He was still Woody, proud, stubborn, and he was determined to go out on top on his terms. So in 1978, the Gator Bowl, Ohio State entered with a 7-3-1 record, not really up to par for them. And by saying that they're in the Gator Bowl, you know, as a college football historian, that means their season didn't go the right way because they're not in the Rose Bowl. That's what that means. So it wasn't a successful season by their standards at 7-3-1. All right, but it was respectable, 7-3-1. Bowl games were important for recruiting, if nothing else. Clemson was led by a head coach named Charlie Pell, and Charlie Pell actually quit the team and took another job after the regular season had ended. And so at this point in our story, Danny Ford has taken over for his first coaching game as the head coach. And this was just before the Danny Ford Clemson team won the national championship around 81, I think. So this Pell, we're getting to the end of the Pell era and into the Danny Ford winning the national championship thing. So, but Clemson's a hungry organization, a rising program, and they're trying to, get on the national scene. And they came into this with a 10-1 record. So, and if you know anything about football back then, you'll know that the scores were much lower, right? 28 points was a lot. It just was. So this was one of those close, hard-fought, physical games, exactly the kind of thing that Woody Hayes would have loved, okay? The Buckeyes had a young quarterback, Art Schlichter. I can't pronounce his name. Young sophomore, big arm. Clemson's defense, they were pretty aggressive. They were pretty relentless, and they were led by a couple of guys named Bubba Brown at linebacker and a safety named Charlie Ballman. Those were their big players. And for most of the game, Ohio State really couldn't quite get out of their own way and get untracked and take control of the game. You know how you're watching a game and as it just goes on, you just feel like one side or the other, or maybe both, they're not in a rhythm. It's ugly. And that's kind of what you're looking at here for Ohio State. Ohio State had thrown a couple of really costly interceptions, so I'm sure Woody was not in a good mood. And Clemson held a really tight 17-15 lead in the fourth quarter. I mean, they're getting close to pulling this thing off, right? Which would be a huge win for an up-and-comer program. And then it happened. With just over 2 minutes left, Ohio State had the ball deep in their own territory, trying to come back from the 17-15 deficit. The quarterback drops back, and he's looking for a safe pass, okay, something to complete and not turn it over. And the ball was tipped and intercepted by Bowman from Clemson, who I've already mentioned, their safety. And he began sprinting down the Ohio State sideline, and he was tackled out of bounds right in front of the Buckeyes bench, which means he was tackled right in front of Woody Hayes, right at Woody Hayes' feet. And then, as he got up from being tackled, he looked at the Ohio State sideline. Now, did he say something? Did he smile? Did he snicker? Whatever it was, Woody Hayes, who was standing right there, completely snapped. Hayes, who was 65 years old at the time, in a split second, he lunged and he punched Ballman, the safety who had gotten the interception and tackled right at his feet. Woody Hayes punched him right square in the throat. Right there on live television, on national television, prime time, 3-channel days television, in a bowl game, Woody Hayes at 65 punched an opposing player right in the throat. And, if I'm not mistaken, they kept him from punching him again because he tried to. Massive TV audience is watching this. Now, players rushed in, coaches rushed in, officials rushed in. Hayes had to be pulled back by his own players. The broadcast cameras caught everything. But at the moment, the crowd didn't know what had happened, and the announcers, it took the announcers, I believe it was Keith Jackson, it took them all a second to figure out what had happened. But it caused like a bench clearing, meeting of the minds, very briefly, very intense, very briefly. And so when the refs saw this, figured out what happened, and they threw the penalty, keep in mind, there were no microphones back then for the referees. So the referees called this unsportsmanlike 15-yard penalty against Hayes, but nobody knows that it's against Hayes at that moment. There were no microphones for the referee to explain this. And so the crowd and the TV announcers, they weren't sure what happened initially. They figured it out, though. And, of course, what's really nuts to me is later on in the game, Woody Hayes went after a referee and grabbed him by the shirt and got another flagrant foul called, another 15-yard, whatever, unsportsmanlike, flagrant, whatever you want to call it. He got another one. And that's just unbelievable. And I don't, you wonder, and I don't know. Nothing I've read says for sure that the referees saw it exactly or whatever the deal was. Obviously, they figured it out somehow, but did they actually see the whole thing escalate? I don't know. But it's unbelievable that that's what happened. And I mean, what was Woody Hayes thinking? 65 years old. Sure, he's frustrated. Sure, the ball got tipped while his team had it. And sure, the other team intercepted and got tackled out of bounds. But it's just hard to believe. It's hard to wrap your mind around the coach's reaction being to take the kid who intercepted the ball and punch him in the throat. It's unbelievable. Ohio State went on and lost that game by that 17-15 score, and by then nobody cared, right? The only thing anyone could talk about was the punch, okay? And like I said, unbelievably later on, he gets another flag for going after a referee. That's worth saying twice. So let's take a second and think about it. The head coach of 28 years or whatever it was, 65-year-old man punches an opposing player in the throat on national television. The cameras did catch it, and I guess they sorted out. I've only seen a highlight of maybe the discussion about it. I don't know if I saw it. I'll put a link in YouTube for what I've found so you can see for yourself. But the point is, it was on camera. And there was no replay back then, and there was no mic for the ref, so it was a little bit confusing about what all had happened. But it was enough, because the next morning, Ohio State Athletic Director Hugh Heineman and University President Harold Anderson met privately, and they didn't need a very longer discussion because they did see the video evidence, and they fired Woody Hayes that day. No fanfare, no press conference, no one last game, no parade, no celebratory ceremony before, nothing. After 28 seasons and 205 wins and 5 national championships, Woody Hayes' career ended in complete disgrace just like that. For Buckeye fans, I'm sure it was heartbreaking. Woody had been like family to him, and for others, it was probably one of those inevitable things. It's tragic, but it was fitting because it was a man whose temper had burned pretty hard, pretty bright, pretty long, and too hot, and people were probably tired of that routine. And Hayes never coached another game. Never coached another game. He gave interviews much later in life, and he never really apologized. He doesn't sound like the guy, to me, he doesn't sound like the guy that would anyway. He never apologized. He expressed regret, but what do they always say? A lot of people aren't upset about what they did. They're upset about the fact that they got caught. And I think that's really what Woody Hayes' deal was. He got dug in on the situation, and so he didn't apologize. He just said, I'm sorry it happened. That's not the same thing. In his mind, he kind of defended his player, but what was there to defend a player from? I have no idea. So it wasn't instinctive or anything. The guy had rage issues, clearly. So I'm sure he regretted at some point that one moment defined him forever, as did their fans and their players. And I'm definitely not making any excuses for him, but time has this funny way of softening the edges a little bit of really tough moments. We all know that. People have the right to be forgiven, even for some pretty atrocious things. So what's the historical take on this? Over the next decade of his life, a little bit of Woody Hayes' reputation and legend sort of rebuilt itself a little bit. He kind of became a symbol of old school coaching, old school in quotes, where it was all about principle and passion and intensity. And even if sometimes you got a little carried away, right? And you could say that about a lot of coaches back then, I'm sure, except only one punched another kid in the throat. He ended up giving speeches on the speaking circuit, and he mentored some young coaches, and he became kind of a grandfatherly figure around Columbus. He stayed, coaches now would pack it up and go. I have a firm belief that most coaches now would pack it up and move to the lake house, but he hung around Columbus. He made amends with some of his old rivals, and, those kinds of acts later in life. I have a friend that grew up there. Tracy, you need to tell me if you ever saw Woody hanging around when you were growing up. I need to ask her about that. When Woody passed away in 1987, he was 74 years old, and 15,000 people attended his memorial service at St. John Arena. And among the speakers there was a guy who was his greatest rival, but also one of his closest friends, and that was none other than Michigan football coach Bo Schembechler. I've heard this before. Frank Broyles and Darrell Royal were actually really good friends, but they were rivals on the field. It must have been the same deal with Schembechler and Woody Hayes. And so here's the quote that Bo Schembechler had that day. He said, "There's a part of Woody Hayes and all of us who ever coached the game of football, and for that we're better men." And even today, if you talk about Ohio State football, you can't, not really think about Woody. The Woody Hayes Athletic Center stands on campus to this day, and his face is etched into the history of the Buckeyes program there forever and ever. Unfortunately, so is that punch, right? It reminds us that greatness can kind of be hand in hand with flaws. Those things kind of live side by side sometimes. And that kind of passion, I guess, through the wrong avenues can destroy some good things that very same passion helped build, right? So, that kind of for the Gen X fans and stuff, this is kind of a generational shift, right? From old school, those authoritarian Army general coaches of the 50s and 60s to more of a modern, almost media conscious type approach in the 80s and 90s and into today. Guys like Bear Bryant, Darrell Royal, and Hayes, those guys were from an era where you intimidated and you ruled with control. And, by the 80s, the world was changing and athletes were becoming more like celebrities. television and the money that it generated was reshaping the game. And fans, they were less tolerant of that kind of, I guess, behavior, volatility, temper, whatever you want to call it. And it kind of makes me wonder if Woody's punching a kid became the end of the my way or the highway kind of mentality. I think the successful coaches still have some control to that degree. I mean, everybody knows Nick Saban's a control freak, right? Most of these coaches are. But if you have that kind of control mixed with that kind of a temper and my way or the highway and all that kind of stuff, I don't think anybody enjoys playing for those guys, and I don't think they do anymore. So by the time the 80s had rolled in, you got Tom Osborne and Jimmy Johnson and names like that kind of had a different approach. Still very tough, but a little bit more adaptable, right? More media savvy, more sensitive to the fact that they were coaching 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old guys. And I think that's always the magic formula. The magic formula is how you can be that tough and that demanding, and yet guys adore you and will do anything for you. I think if you have one of those or the other, you're not successful. I think it takes both. And that probably goes, in my mind, for any sport at just about any level. So we Gen Xers, we kind of grew up in that transition on the national sports scene. When football evolved from really a generation coming out of war, literally, and you bringing that kind of discipline as coaches into it, and a little bit more of a sort of a full color sort of spectacle that it became, a little bit different situation. And that's what makes Woody Hayes' story so powerful. It's a reminder that sports aren't just about their own life in a vacuum. They're not just about their own competition. They sort of reflect culture. They really do. And so that's one of the things that I find interesting about sports. So what's the long game here? What's Woody Hayes thought of now and so forth? Well, Woody Hayes will always be remembered as one of the greatest coaches. I mean, did you hear me say 5 national championships? I mean, come on. Most complicated, controversial, and yet successful kind of guy you can think of, actually. He was all about discipline and loyalty and toughness, but his downfall, this has happened to other people. Think about Bobby Knight throwing a chair across the arena, right, in the middle of a game. We've seen some images sort of like this since then. Not many, but Bobby Knight comes to mind as one example. Urban Meyer, speaking of Ohio State, Urban Meyer got fired from Jacksonville because he in his mind, playfully, kicked one of his own players while he was stretching, and the player did not take it as playful whatsoever. And, it was an intimidation move on his part, supposedly. So these things have happened since. They really have. But it wasn't just the end of his career that night. It was the end of sort of an entire approach to coaching. So the Iron Fist approach was pretty much out after that. For those of us who grew up watching football back then, 70s and 80s, I mean, like I said, I don't remember it exactly, but I do remember it happening and the media outpouring that came from that. Once again, pre-ESPN days. It's just one of those, it's just unbelievable what I was reading about this. And I don't know what's so shocking about it, except for the fact that, you would think we're more jaded in society now and kind of just shrug at this, but it's shocking. And it's even more shocking to find out that he didn't get tossed and that later in the game, he put his hands on a referee. Later in the same game. So anyway, that's hard to believe. So all these decades later, it's just still kind of a head scratcher. And, it's complicated, but it's quite an unbelievable event from my childhood, remembering when I heard about this. So if you have been listening to us for the last few weeks, I want to say thank you. And I want to say thank you for your time today. And I want to ask you if you don't mind clicking a like or clicking a subscribe or a thumbs up or whatever you got to let us know we're doing okay. And we will talk to you in another week, and we'll bring you something else from the Generation X world of sports. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.